Welcome back to Sprague Homestead. So we're going to talk some more about feed and feeding, and today we're talking all about feeding your breeding stock. Alright, so the first thing we're going to talk about in feeding your breeding stock, let's talk about bucks. The reason we're going to talk about bucks first is that there's not a lot to talk about. With does, we've got different life changes, cycles, things like that. The bucks, it's pretty much straightforward from the time that they've weaned off all the way to the end. So when we're talking about our bucks, we're not talking about a whole lot of really exciting stuff. So we're really going to shoot for about a 3% fat in our feed. We're going to shoot for anywhere from about 15 to 16% on our protein. And as always, we're going to shoot for 20 to 25-ish percent fiber. $20 is what I really shoot for. 25 is getting a little bit high, but in a buck, it really won't hurt them. So this is what we're really looking for overall in our feed. Most commercial feeds, you're going to find pretty much that. Bucks don't need a lot of additives as they go along, pretty much right from the get-go. So if you've watched our growing meat pins video, you know that basically we try and wean anywhere from 6 to 10 weeks old. It depends a little bit on the breed. I prefer myself 8 to 10 weeks, especially on the bigger rabbits. They seem to do a little bit better. And other than giving them a little bit of grass hay, or Timothy hay, orchard grass, whatever, when we first wean, we pretty much stick to these numbers and we don't get into a lot of additives. The reason why we don't is because bucks really don't need them. Now in the market pen video, we're trying to get those rabbits to market weight. So we're doing things like we're adding barley and we're adding sunflower seeds. We don't need to do that here. Of course, if you're growing a buck for show, that's a whole different animal. But if you're just growing these guys to be meat breeders, basically, this is it. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. They don't need a whole lot of other stuff. You can kick in greens. Like I always tell everybody, try and avoid them under 12 weeks. Go slow and really do your homework on what you're feeding and how that affects them. There are some things that I absolutely tell people, unless you are having a rabbit off a feed, there are some no's when it comes to bucks. No alfalfa. So a lot of your commercial rabbit feed are alfalfa based. That's fine. They do the minerals to compensate for the extra calcium in alfalfa. There should never be a reason, unless your rabbit is off of feed and you're trying to get them going again, there's never really a good reason to feed alfalfa for your bucks. High calcium levels lead to urinary calculi. It can lead to all kinds of dysfunctions in breeding and just is not something you want to do. The other thing, again, unless they're off, no calf manna. Now, if you just watched our video on mixing feed, I do talk about how to add calf manna in if you're trying to up protein. You'll have seen it on the spreadsheet. And then in the mixing video, we do talk about calf manna. I have a love-hate relationship with it. Try not to use it on your bucks. It's heavy in calcium. There's a lot of other things you can do to get the balances that you want without adding it. It's just not really something the boys need. So there's no real reason to add it. Things that are okay, barley, sunflower seeds, very, very small quantities. The biggest thing I can tell you about feeding bucks is don't let them get fat. Everybody who tries to free feed, it will end up biting you in the long run. A buck that gets fat will build up fat around his testicles. They'll build up internal fat too, but the big thing is you don't want them getting fat and overheating their testicles, making them sluggish breeders, and it will actually drop their sperm count. So if we're going for big litters, which is what we're going for in our meat rabbits, we want big litters of healthy kits. A fat rabbit is not going to do that. So I've talked in some of these other videos about really most feeds are about 1 ounce per pound of body weight. I suggest with your bucks checking them monthly. And for some of you, it might mean put them on the scale. For me, I've been doing this long enough that once I've got a baseline of what my boys are at, I just run a hand over them every now and then, and I can get a really good idea if those boys are pulling too much weight. Until you get the hang of it, you might want to put a scale on them. And this especially is true once they've hit senior weight. So where a little bit of alfalfa or a little bit of calf manna might be okay as their juniors growing, especially if they're slow for some reason. Sometimes your winter babies will be a little slow to go if it's really cold, or your summer babies can be a little slow to grow because they go off feed in the heat. But basically, the guys don't need it. It's not worth it. So they should just pretty much be getting whatever your feed is. If you're doing hay, that's fine. If you've seen the hay video and understand how to work the numbers out. Other than that, they don't need it. A lot of bucks won't eat hay anyway. It's just not who they are. At least none of the commercial bucks I've ever had. And that's it. This is pretty much it. When you get them to this is their life until the end. Like I said, you can put greens and stuff in, but this is really what you're looking for. They do fine on it. I've got plenty of boys that are 6 and pushing 7 right now, which in meat breeds can be on the older side. So this is it. This is all they really need. All right, so moving on, let's talk about the ladies. Okay, so the girls are going to be on a similar kind of thing up to breeding age, right? So really, we're still going to work on about a 3% fat, 16% protein, 20% fiber, give or take. So this is pretty much the holy grail of feeding your rabbits. This is really where you want to be. You can even come down to 15% protein. It won't hurt them. Although in the bigger rabbits, 16 is probably the better place to go. In a smaller breed, you can cut that down, but really this is where we're going to go. This is where you're going to hold your doe all the way to breeding age. And in some breeds, that's 6 months. In some breeds, that's 9 months. And I think I'm going to have a video talking about that because that's a question we're getting a whole lot now is when is it time to breed? But regardless, this is what you're going to hold them to. Now, here's what you're going to see. When you breed your doe, a lot of does will do one of two things. When they get about 2 weeks in, and some does vary, but about 2 weeks in, remember we go 31 days, 2 weeks into a pregnancy, we will either start pigging out or we will slack off. And this really does depend entirely on the doe. So it really does depend on the doe. If we're pigging out and we're going through our feed, do not start giving her extra feed. This is not really the time to let them get any fatter. I know people who the minute they breed, they start free feeding. Don't do this. You don't want your doe getting fat while she's trying to grow kits. There is no benefit to her overeating while she's pregnant. Now, I've had people say, well, she's eating for 12. And rabbits really don't do that. The growing of the kits does not take as much nutrition as the actual raising of the kits and the feeding. So while you might, after the first 2 weeks, go up a little bit, and by a little bit, I mean maybe 1 or 2 ounces, really do not be tempted by the pigging out. If your doe does the opposite and slacks off, just keep an eye on her. Keep trying to tempt her with other feeds. Now, some girls are just like humans, uncomfortable as they get pregnant and get halfway through. This is where I might be tempted if they're not eating all of their feed, a little bit of alfalfa. If you're not already feeding greens, a little bit of greens, maybe a little bit of calf manna, and I'm talking like a tablespoon, or black oil sunflower seeds if you're not already using them. What you really want to see is you want a consistency of feed. Because what we've gotten pigging out, say they're going along this, that's a spike, we don't want that. If they're doing this, we don't want that either. We really want to try and keep that nice level feed all the way through. Sometimes that's not going to work. If it's hot, if it's cold, whatever it is, you might see an uptick or a downtick. Like I said, past the 2 week mark, if you need to go up an ounce or two, that's fine. do not start free feeding that doe. Don't be tempted. She's going to try and trick you into it. I've got some harlequins that do that. With the slacking off, add a little bit something. Make sure that that doe is still getting nutrients. The biggest thing here, water. Make sure absolutely they're getting the water that they need. All right, so in the last week of pregnancy, 95% of your does will slack off. Some of them wait for the last 3 or 4 days, but usually it's the last week, and it's not unusual in the last 3 days for them to just go cold turkey, not eat. My Americans do that. Most of my harlequins do. I say 95% because you always have those girls that start binging for some reason in the last week. Again, don't let them do this. What we don't want is we don't want a whole lot of wild shocks to the system, right? Digestion is digestion, and blood sugar levels are blood sugar levels. If we can keep them eating at the same level all the way to the end, we don't have any wild spikes, which can cause abortion, miscarriage, or even death. I've heard of people free feeding their does, and right at the end, they start pigging out and die. So don't do that. This is another reason why I'm really big on portion control when it comes to your rabbits. You really want to make sure that they're eating the same amount all the way through. But in the last week, don't be surprised if they cut off. You can add a little bit of stuff. Calf manna is okay. Alfalfa is okay in very small quantities, like I was saying. If they wait until the last 3 days and pretty much go off feed, I don't even bother adding anything in. They're either going to eat or they're not. And for some reason, in the last 3 days, most does will completely just quit eating. So as long as they're taking in water, don't be too worried about it. All right, so we've reached day 31, 32. Your does have had their babies. Now's the time to free feed, right? No, we're still not there yet. So what we're going to do now, we're from birth to 48 hours post-delivery. We're going to do almost nothing. This is not a time for additives. This is the time for regular feed. So if you've been supplementing for the last week or so with a little extra alfalfa or calf manna, cut it out. Don't bother putting any of that in. They don't need it yet. This is where you want to increase hay. If you're not already feeding hay, now is the time to kick some in. Basically, since most girls go off of feed for 2 to 3 days prior to delivery, what we want to do is make sure that that digestive system isn't getting locked up and continuing to function. I've got girls that absolutely will not touch feed until 2 or 3 days after delivery. All they'll eat is hay. So you want to make sure that you've got a good grass hay, orchard grass, Timothy, whatever it is that you're using. But this is the time to have hay on hand. And like I said, I throw in a whole bunch. I don't feed them any more than what they've been getting. What you might find is that you'll have fed one night and they won't have touched it. That's fine. They will. Just keep that gut moving. Lots of water, lots of hay, and add nothing else. All right, so once we hit the 48-hour mark, your does should be back to eating. If they're not, that's fine as long as they're eating their grass hay. This is where you really want to be checking your kits. Are they eating? Do we feel like they're getting good milk? Remember that rabbits typically only feed in the morning, so that's really when you need to be checking. If you check too early, you might be before mom feeds. If you check too late, they might have already started digesting that milk, and so they might not be the fat little monkeys that you need them to be. So the big thing is don't try and check in the evening because they may have already fed them earlier in the day. What you want to see is good kit movement at 48 hours. They need to be pretty active, pretty robust. You can also at this point take mom out, especially if you've been handling her, and kind of feel and see how her mammary glands are doing. If you don't think that she's feeding, this is critical that now you start adding calf manna or other things that help build milk production. My favorites during the growing season, dandelion is absolutely my go-to for my does when they first had babies. Just a couple of leaves if they're not used to greens. Ours get it fairly often during the growing season, so I'll give them, a bunch a good half handful anyway. Dandelion will help with milk production, so this is worth having and doing. Raspberry leaf. And blackberry leaf, I think, does the same thing. They do a couple of things. One, they help with female issues as she's healing up from birth. But this will also help with your milk production. And now is the time to also add a little calf manna. Not every doe will need this. If they seem to be milking fine, if the kits are growing fine, then don't bother. When you add calf manna, you're only going to give a 10-pound doe maybe a teaspoon to 2 teaspoons. They don't need a lot. But the calcium in this, just like the calcium in dandelion, will actually spur on some milk production and keep them going. So this is going to be for the first week and a half. If your doe is really having trouble milking, it does happen litter to litter. I've had does that go 3 or 4 litters and do fine, and then all of a sudden we have a bad litter. You can keep supplementing this if you need all the way out to 2 weeks or so when the kits start coming out of the nest box. This is a big deal in does that produce a lot of milk. You might actually want to cut back on some of that kind of stuff. I've heard of does that have small litters that actually end up killing their kits because of too much milk production. So if she's milking okay, there's no real benefit to this, except maybe that raspberry leaf, because like I said, it helps with female issues and can help her get all going, and it'll help flush anything that might still be in there, because it does happen. So this is what I kind of go for. I don't like to add alfalfa in this time period unless you don't have any of this kind of stuff. If it's winter, you might want to kick in some alfalfa if you don't have any dried dandelion or raspberry leaf on hand. So this is going to go 48 hours all the way to about a week to 2 weeks post-delivery. Okay? There is no real benefit for this after the fact, because usually by 2 weeks you've got kits coming out of the box. All right, on top of this, how you're going to change your feed. We're still not going to free feed. It's just not something we're going to do quite yet. You're going to do your normal ration of feed plus an extra half. So if you're feeding 10 ounces of feed or 8 ounces of feed to that doe, you're going to add an extra 4 or 5 ounces. The big thing is you want to make sure she's cleaning all of her feed up. If she's leaving a whole bunch, then she really doesn't need it yet. If she acts like she's absolutely starving, keep a close eye on her body condition. She might be producing at a heavier rate than you think, and you may have to go up on feed. The big thing is we're trying to hold body condition. Yes, all does will lose some weight and will thin out a little bit post-delivery, but the big thing is not only are we trying to get that back a little bit, we're also trying to make sure that we aren't losing condition, because as we lose condition, nutrients are getting moved and we're dropping our milk production, and we're actually dropping the nutrients that the kits are getting. So during this period, we're going to a ration and a half. All right, so 2 weeks to weaning. Now I give you permission to do full feeders. So now we're going to free feed. Okay, go ahead and keep those feeders full. Unless you have a doe that you find is just pigging out. Because remember, we want to try and keep her metabolism pretty even. I have a couple of harlequins that when you get to the free feed stage, you've really got to watch them. There are some products out that you can make creep feeders and things, even for rabbits. That can be a benefit. I've never actually used them. I usually just watch it. But from about 2 weeks on, this is about the time the kits are out of the box. And pretty much as soon as they start out of the box, they're going to start doing what mom does. So if mom's eating feed, they're going to eat feed. This is also a time that if you want, you can be throwing in a handful of hay every day or into a feeder or whatever. Just make sure your hay feeder is down enough that the kids can get it. Hay at this age isn't going to hurt anything. In fact, it's going to keep their little digestive systems running just fine. and they're just nibbling at it. It's not until about 4 weeks or so that you really start to see a difference. I have the bigger J feeders. Most of mine, if I fill them at night, Mom still has half a thing at the next day, and that's when you've got kids that are 2 and 3 weeks. Usually by 4 weeks, they're starting to pretty much pound down a whole feeder. And that's, I think I have the 7.5 or 9s, whatever it is. At this point, if you have been feeding Mom calf manna or anything else extra, you can cut it off. You don't really want the kits getting into it. So as soon as they're out, if she's not having condition problems, go ahead and take her off. If she's still having condition problems, one, I would really seriously think about removing that doe from my program. But you can just mount a feeder, like a feed bowl, up high enough that the kids can't get it, and you can continue with some additives. You shouldn't need it. After 2 weeks, once those kids are out of the box, you shouldn't need it because their milk consumption is already starting to dip, believe it or not. So we're going to free feed all the way to weaning. All right, so depending on when you've weaned, we've now hit the post-weaning. The kits are gone. Mom's back to hanging out in her cage by herself. And we're going right back to our regular feeding. So you're going to go right back to where you were. Now, if Mom has lost some weight, which happens, and you're not going to rebreed her right away, you may bump up her normal feed just a little bit, trying to get her back into the body condition you want. Remember that what we're shooting for in meat rabbits, which is different than a lot of other things, we want does that can wean a litter and be really just about ready to rebreed. So if your does are really coming down after delivery and after weaning, and are really losing a lot of body condition, it might not be a doe you want to continue breeding. Now, if she's over 3, it happens, but you don't really want to see a whole lot of weight loss in a doe that's 1 year or 2 years old. So you really, at post-wean, you should be rolling right back into pretty much the same ration and continuing on from there. Now remember, once we hit back onto this, they're going to stay on this pretty close to delivery. Once again, the cycle starts all over again. I'm not big on additives for does. The biggest thing that will hurt you in does is just like in bucks. Do not let them get fat. There is no reason when she doesn't have a litter that she should ever be on free feed. Some does will regulate, just like dogs, cats, goats. Some will self-regulate, but most domestic rabbits will not turn it off. They will keep eating even when they don't need it, and they will get fat. So no free feeding. No free feed. Fat does is the #1 reason that a doe won't get pregnant is because she is fat. So no free feeding. You just don't want to have to go through the whole dieting process. Okay, so one other thing I'll make mention of is, what do you do if during the free feeding process with your kids, your doe has gotten a little portly? It does happen. I have some Harlequin lines that are notorious for that. I think they fight their kids off and eat as much as they possibly can because they want to. So if your doe has post-weaning got a little fat, we're not actually going to put them back into the ration eat. If they're fat, now is the time to diet. And I hear everybody going, oh, diet. Yeah, no, seriously, this is the time to do it. Don't put them back on this ration and let them hold that fat. The longer they hold too much weight, the more that fat really builds up around the internal organs. That's not a good thing. So if your girls are a little too portly, what you're going to do is you're going to go half of their normal ration. And remember, we do that by weight, so half of whatever they were feeding, they would normally be getting here. They're going to get half a ration, and they are going to get grass hay. Okay? Like I said, now is the time to make them lose weight if you can. So what I like to do in this kind of situation, if your doe comes out of a litter too fat, you're going to do this for 2 weeks and rebreed. If for some reason it's too hot, it's too cold, it's not convenient, you're not ready to rebreed, hold them to this until you get them to a condition that you want, and then put them back. If this doesn't work, what it'll do is if it doesn't bring their weight down right away, what it will do is it'll do something called flushing. And basically, the diminished amount of feed kind of triggers mentally, and this doesn't work as well in all breeds as it does in some, but it mentally kind of kicks into a primal deal where in early spring, like before the grass comes on, in wild rabbits, protein levels and things drop, which is what happens when you add pretty much half grass to your ration. Your protein levels drop. So the body thinks, okay, well, now is not a good time to breed, or now is the time that we need to just kind of lay back. We're not going to breed right now because the nutrients isn't there, right? So in flushing, when we drop the nutrients, then what we're going to do is you're going to go back to your ration after that. And usually it doesn't take but a day. All right, so there you have it for the folks that have been asking, how do I feed my breeding stock? That's kind of the overview of how you should be feeding them as you go. Remember, we're pretty much looking for 3 to 3.5% in your fat, 16%-ish around in your protein, and somewhere around 20 to anywhere up to 25% in your fiber. So that's going to be your basic. Boys are pretty much going to feed the same thing forever. Girls will adjust based on the breeding cycle. So if you have questions, feel free to leave them down in the comments. I will do my best to get back to you. Remember to really listen to what your rabbits are saying. They will tell you what they need. If they are losing weight, you need to increase your feed. If they're not milking, you need to increase their calcium. If they are too fat, they need a diet. So just really kind of monitor. A lot of people will throw rabbits into a cage and just forget about them. Don't do that. That's not doing you any favors. So, watch your body condition and let your rabbits talk to you and kind of go from there. So that is it for today from Sprague Homestead. I know this was kind of a long video, but like I said, if you have questions, leave them down in the bottom. And that is it for today. We will see you next time, and happy homesteading.